Good morning, everyone. I hope you all are doing well, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to my talk remotely. Today, I'm going to be discussing responses to violence in the Colombian Amazon region through a reading of the grassroots publication Catarsis, la revista literaria del Putumayo. This talk is derived from an article that I have forthcoming, and it's also the basis for one of my dissertation chapters. So just to give you a sense of how this research fits into that larger project, my dissertation examines the intersecting histories of nonviolent politics and environmental thought in Colombia, especially as they inform critiques of violence in the post-1991 neoliberal period. I'm interested in how activists and intellectuals have reframed political subjectivity in more ecological terms to include not only humans, but also plants, rivers, forests, and other non-human beings. By moving beyond the individual human rights subject and politicizing a variety of forms of life, I argue that these thinkers pose an epistemic challenge to official discourses that equate peace with neoliberal economic development. So I structure this analysis around four scenes that I think render visible Colombia's relation to other militarized spaces throughout the global South: the plantation, the extractive frontier, the reintegration settlement, and the urban periphery. The paper that I'm presenting today pertains to the extractive frontier. We begin on the outskirts of La Hormiga Putumayo, where the Biblioteca Pública Luis Carlos Galán stands engulfed by a patch of forest that recedes into the Amazonian borderlands between Colombia and Ecuador. Barely visible beneath the leaves of a mahogany tree, Che Guevara's iconic face emblazons the sidewall above an inscription proclaiming that La única lucha que se pierde es la que se abandona. The library's physical position, inconspicuous, almost hidden, yet defiant, reflects the social significance that it acquired in the mid-2000s when La Hormiga and the greater municipality of Valle del Guamúes were occupied by the right-wing Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia. Paramilitary forces imposed an authoritarian regime of social control throughout Valle del Guamúes and other parts of the lower Putumayo from 1997 until their official demobilization in 2006. One group of students and civic leaders responded by forming the Grupo de Amigos de la Biblioteca, or GAB, an organization that leveraged the seemingly apolitical space of the library in order to subvert censorship through activities like radio broadcasts, discussion forums, and writing workshops. Perhaps the most enduring product of their cultural activism, however, is Catarsis, la revista literaria del Putumayo. With 10 issues published since 2004, Catarsis contains writings on political, social, and cultural topics, as well as visual art and poetry. When I first came across the magazine in 2018, I was intrigued by the fact that the editors presented it as both una estrategia de resistencia a la guerra and la puerta literaria del Putumayo. What does it mean for a magazine to resist war? How do geopolitics fit into this project, especially considering the long history of militarization and misguided encounters with the lettered city that Putumayo has endured since the Spanish conquest? And what does the critique of paramilitary violence imply for reconceiving Amazonia's relation to Colombia and to the planet? In thinking about these questions, I was struck by the range of adjectives that the magazine employs in conjunction with the concept of resistance: sutil, discreta, disfrazada, oculta, camuflada, and even infrapolítica. I use the term subterranean resistance as a way of encompassing all of these descriptions, and also as a way of thinking about cultural work that seeks to alter society through the material fabric of relations that lay beneath the surface of what is visibly political. Rather than openly confronting armed actors, Catarsis sheds light on a theory and practice of resistance that, to paraphrase Tania Lizarazo, takes place not so much against violence as alongside it, in the everyday struggle to live differently in militarized spaces. The magazine critiques the extractivist, militaristic, and authoritarian dimensions of paramilitarism by engaging Putumayo as a territory, which, following Arturo Escobar, I understand to mean a place-based framework linking history, culture, environment, and social life. This takes place at the level of both representation and practice. Catarsis destabilizes many of the tropes that have historically sustained violence in Amazonia, but it also articulates embodied networks of readers and writers who participate in the formation of new relationships between people, places, and the circulation of knowledge. By reimagining and reconfiguring territory in this way, the magazine prefigures a demilitarized ecological social imaginary that is at once aesthetic and concrete. More than 50 years of conflict between state forces, leftist guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, and drug traffickers have meant that Colombia is often viewed through the figures of the narco, the guerrillero, and the para. In a country where the topic of violence is so pervasive that it has given rise to a special class of experts known as violentólogos, I think that it's important to ask where and how alternatives to militarized social life have been imagined. The abundance of scholarship on cultural forms such as the novela de la violencia, narco-culture, and testimonio has offered valuable insights into the complexities of writing in and about armed conflict. However, the body of cultural production originating from grassroots organizations, rather than individual authors, filmmakers, and artists, remains understudied. By examining the poetics of resistance and catharsis, I hope to draw attention to an area of intellectual practice that is often elided in discussions of the Colombian conflict. At the same time, because Putumayo has never been cut off from global flows of capital, my reading of the magazine seeks to offer a point of departure for thinking about nonviolence and the politics of life in the global South more broadly. Putumayo has long inspired literary attempts to reconcile with the violent underside of modernity. Most of us probably think of works written during the rubber boom, such as Roger Casement's Blue Book and novelas de la selva like La Vorágine. As Carolina Sá Carvalho, Michael Taussig, and Leslie Wiley have noted, these works all contain elements of testimonial discourse in that they seek to convey the horrors of the rubber enclave to audiences located outside of Putumayo. Testimonio has also played a significant role in documenting more recent periods of violence, as we see in the Revista Testimonial Regambre, which was established by journalist Maria Cecilia Silva in the 1990s, as well as a number of reports on violence commissioned by the Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica since its founding in 2011. Situated chronologically between these two, Catharsis participates in the discursive economy of testimonio, but rather than positioning the margin at the center, as John Beverly describes the mechanism by which testimonio mediates subaltern experience, Catharsis treats the margin as the center. It is less concerned with affecting readers in Bogotá or the global north than with constructing a regional Putumayense reading public. Although the tropical lowlands of the Putumayo River Basin attracted intense national interest during the border disputes that accompanied the rise of the rubber industry in the early 20th century, for most of Colombian history they have been legally defined as tierras baldías, territorios de misiones, and dependencias of other administrative units. These designations symbolically empty Putumayo of its political and human dimensions, which of course has taken place alongside the real dispossession of indigenous peoples and the concentration of political power in the Andean highlands. Successive waves of colonization driven by export commodities such as quina, rubber, timber, oil, and most recently coca, have profoundly shaped the ethnic and social contours of a department in which the majority currently identifies as not indigenous, but colonos and campesinos. Valle del Guamúes was founded by colonos who arrived during the oil boom in the 1960s, and its population grew tremendously in the 1990s as a result of the burgeoning coca economy. The term colono, however, obscures a wide range of racial and ethnic subjectivities, as well as the enduring presence of Cofan, Awa, Nasa, and other indigenous groups in the municipality. Catharsis weaves together a pluriethnic fabric of voices which draws mostly from the colono campesino population, but also includes indigenous and Afro-Amazonian contributors. What appears to connect these disparate perspectives is a shared sense of place, especially in connection with the selva that dominates both the Putumayan landscape and the magazine's aesthetic. This sense of place was violently disrupted when paramilitary leaders Carlos and Vicente Castaño Gil sent forces to reconquer southwestern Colombia in December of 1996. Motivated by the prospect of profiting from the cocaine trade, controlling oil infrastructure, and suppressing social movements that threatened their alliance with agro-industrial capital, paramilitaries began their invasion of Valle del Guamúes by committing a horrific massacre at the inspectorate of El Tigre. This was followed by a chain of mass killings in El Placer, La Dorada, and rural areas of the municipality. The US military aid package known as Plan Colombia exacerbated paramilitary violence over the following years. Caught in the crosshairs of both the war against leftist guerrilla organizations and the global war on drugs, Putumayenses were increasingly stigmatized for living in a narco-guerrilla enclave, a condition that, as Winifred Tate notes, led to the de facto denial of their rights as citizens on the basis of assumed criminality. In a retrospective on the Massacre del Tigre, a regular contributor to Catarsis who writes under the pseudonym Najed reflects on the difficult task of recovering la hermosa piel del tigre, sus manchas amarillas, sus rosetas moteadas, sus mandíbulas, sus extremidades, sus ropas, sus correas, sus documentos, su cabeza, su tronco. Characterizing the massacre as a tigricidio, Najed mourns the ruins of a social body that includes not only the documents, clothing, and remains of the disappeared, but also fragments of plants and animals. The speaker wonders whether it is even possible to make reparations for crímenes contra la humanidad y contra la paz en nuestra verde selva, which have affected an entire territorio. This indictment suggests a scale of destruction that stretches beyond the individual human rights victims considered under Colombia's transitional justice laws to encompass the broader ecologies that constitute territory. Paramilitarism in Valle del Guamúes altered territory in profound ways, producing what Ulrich Oslander calls geographies of terror, or new spatial configurations that take shape as a result of forced displacement, ecological destruction, and alterations in people's sense of place. The Guamúes River, once a source of life and vitality, became a space of death filled with the bodies of the disappeared. Crops and human lives were devastated by toxic defoliants, and the experience of territory was disrupted by the ubiquitous presence of armed men who stigmatized objects signifying a connection between people and land, such as the rubber boots worn by campesinos. Daniel Ruiz Serna astutely describes this sort of destruction as violence against territory, which emphasizes the intersubjectivity of suffering involving people, humans, and even places. Deeply imbricated in the territorial practices of displacement, dispossession, and ecocide that became routine following Colombia's neoliberal turn in the 1990s, paramilitarism further embodies what Macarena Gómez Barris calls an extractive view that sees territories as commodities, rendering land for its taking, while also devalorizing the hidden worlds that form the nexus of human and non-human multiplicity. Catharsis is, at one level, an attempt to recuperate these hidden worlds from the wreckage of extractive capitalism. This is evident in an article from issue 7 that cast the oil boom town of Orito as a metonym for Putumayo as a whole. As the eterno alimentador de energías que sostienen la economía mundial, Orito, and Putumayo by extension, has been subjected to multiple cycles of extractive violence. However, the author proposes that the very sustrato energético that fuels dispossession might also contain the seeds of resistance. Suggesting that subterranean energy be diverted away from commodity extraction and redirected into a practice of living in relation to the positive potentialities that flow through Amazonian subsoil, this piece is an invitation to consider other ways in which Catharsis portrays resistance as a subterranean project. According to anthropologist and Catharsis co-founder Andrés Cancimance, the authoritarian nature of paramilitary control in Putumayo compelled people to resist desde una apariencia de no resistencia. Citing James C. Scott, Cancimance characterizes Catharsis as an example of aquellas formas de insubordinación disfrazadas, discretas, ocultas, que se pueden adecuadamente llamar la infrapolítica. Infrapolitics here refers to subtle resistant practices that emerge from what Scott calls the hidden transcript of assertions that must be concealed because their open expression would be dangerous. Catharsis can be read along these lines as a means of expressions that use literature and its affiliation with the library as cover to evade paramilitary surveillance. Cancimance thus reflects that the magazine provided una opción sutil de protestar, un lenguaje alterno a la voz denunciante y reclamante que los paramilitares no podían vetar o castigar. Gloria Nupan, a librarian in La Hormiga and core member of the Catharsis editorial board, similarly notes in her prologue to issue 6 that the magazine was conceived as a space where people could express their esperanzas, dolores y decepciones, camuflándolas con metáforas y todas las figuras literarias que el lenguaje nos regala. An example of such linguistic camouflaging appears in the piece José y su dorada multitud, published by Najed in issue 1. Although details are never specified, the unjustly murdered Jose of Najed's text, resembles Jose Hurtado, a merchant who was assassinated after leading a protest against paramilitaries in January of 2005. The silhouette of a man in a rocking chair, upon which the text is superimposed, might suggest Hurtado's haunting presence, or perhaps the knowing gaze of everyday people who witnessed his death. The magazine's content is not always camouflaged, however, nor does it remain entirely confined to a small circle of readers. Particularly in more recent issues published after the demobilization of the autodefensas, which, although significant, did not by any means mark the end of paramilitarism in Putumayo. Direct expressions of solidarity with social movements such as the Ruta Pacífica de las Mujeres and progressive leaders like Father Alcides Jiménez Chicangana are common. Some writings originally published in Catarsis, such as the short piece entitled El Edificio by Delia Alicia Escobar, have reached readers well beyond Putumayo. This text, which first appeared in issue 5, narrates 3 decades of history in El Placer through the lens of a building that has served as headquarters for guerrilla forces, paramilitaries, and now the police. Significantly, El Edificio is cited and partially reproduced in the official report on paramilitary violence in El Placer, commissioned by the Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica. The remarkable nature of this encounter between Catarsis and the national readership of historical memory reports underscores the magazine's otherwise marginal position vis-a-vis the institutions of lettered knowledge in Colombia. Distributed for free throughout Putumayo, Catarsis is also invisible from the perspective of the commercial and urban-dominated literary field, embodying what political theorist Luis Tapia identifies as lo subterráneo, aquello que no se ve porque escapa a los procesos de mercantilización y se organiza inclusive como socialidad, estética y política alternativa o contraria. The Subterranean counter-project that takes place through Catarsis is less concerned with being visible to outside audiences than with rethinking the aesthetic, affective, and social dimensions of territory within Putumayo. Life in its multiple human and non-human forms is central to this project. Putumayo, like other spaces of neoliberal globalization where irregular forces exercise the sovereign right to kill, is governed by what Achille Mbembe calls necropower, or the capacity to decide who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who is not. Catarsis responds by asserting that Putumayense life does matter. However, the magazine also forces us to move beyond the question of who lives and dies to consider what, where, and how life is defined. By situating resistance in the web of life that constitutes territory, Catarsis politicizes wider ensembles of humans, plants, animals, and places that make life livable. In this way, it enacts in the realm of representation what Christina Lyons, in another context, calls life politics. The prologue to issue 1 is telling in this regard, as it claims that Putumayenses should not submit to a condition of annihilation or bare survival, because la vida está más allá de nuestros ojos. Lo que se puede palpar no siempre existe, y el mundo es finito para las posibilidades de la mente humana. Los muertos jamás trancarán nuestras puertas, porque la vida siempre puede, y los fusiles no son blindados. Noting the possibility of imagining life beyond what can be seen, this prologue establishes Catarsis' attempt to alter how geographies of violence that puncture Putumayo are perceived. The magazine's serial structure and overarching visual grammar extend this politics of life to the non-human dimensions of territory as well. From issue 4 onward, Catarsis traverses Putumayo from south to north, with each issue focusing on a different municipal subdivision. The purpose of this progression, according to one contributor, is to reescribir Putumayo and present la imagen de un territorio con propuestas. Catarsis intercalates plants and animals with written content, sometimes superimposing text onto images of trees, or having animals walk across the pages of the magazine. The aesthetics of territory, plants, animals, river, selva, are present throughout the magazine, as seen in the Amazonian flora and fauna featured in the recurring prose sections Meditaciones en prosa and La letra y la selva perdida. The photo selected for the Meditaciones section of issue 4 is particularly suggestive of the political link between ecology, writing, and life. As beneath the tree, we can see a quote from the Greek poet Odysseus Elitis that reads, "Escribo para que la muerte no tenga la última palabra." Similar to the tree that lives on in a cleared field, this pairing of text and image seems to suggest that writing also invokes the potential of life amidst death. Gloria Nupan makes one objective of this territorial project clear when she writes that catarsis is el aliento de aquellos que sueñan con dar a conocer la otra cara de su región, mostrando que Putumayo no es una sola mancha roja de sangre. Podemos demostrar que en Putumayo vive gente que siente, piensa, ama y aspira a la paz, que lee y escribe como en cualquier otro lugar del mundo. As Leslie Wiley notes, the mancha roja de sangre that came to represent Putumayo at the turn of the 21st century reproduces a long-established discourse of demonization and exclusion, which has legitimized countless acts of violence and dispossession in the region. As suggested by the images shown earlier and the slogan, Entre la selva y el cielo estamos, that is printed on each issue, Catharsis portrays tropical forests not as a green hell or romanticized paradise lost, but as a dynamic and inhabited source of vitality. As GAB member Jorge Palacios writes, Catharsis gathers las diferentes producciones literarias que surgen como llamas de esperanza desde los rincones de la hermosa Amazonía. The magazine in turn becomes La Puerta Literaria del Putumayo, which beckons readers to hear las historias detrás de cada susurro, que se amplíe el espectro de lo que es Putumayo, que los prejuicios se desdibujen con cada palabra leída y que la magia de la verde de la selva los atrape como lectores de lo aquí contenido. The notion that passing through this puerta literaria also involves becoming trapped in the selva underscores the interconnectedness between ecology, storytelling, and ideology. This emplaced view challenges the internalization of negative tropes through immersion in the very spaces that have been flattened by lettered discourse. In constructing alternative images of Putumayo, Catharsis further contests the very ways in which knowledge about Amazonia has been produced. An essay published by GAB member José Revelo in issue 5 argues that due to a lack of written records, history must be uncovered from other materials, entre los resquicios de las casas de tabla, entre las voces de sus habitantes, por las vías y los ríos, todos estos lugares que escriben y que intentamos leer desde el Bajo Putumayo. These objects and living forces write and can be read by people living in Putumayo. In contrast to books based on textual archives, Catharsis registers the product of thinking in and with territory. Revelo almost calls for the region to write itself, further elaborating that this process would generate an historia informal que se teje y se desteje día a día en las lecturas de nuestros habitantes. As Revelo goes on to explain, this informal history, continuously written in dwellings, rivers, and forests, appears distinct from, and even disrupted by, the printed texts that are available for Putumayenses to read about their own region. This argument decenters writing, even as it refuses to reject the written word as one of many ways to convey knowledge about Putumayo. In this and other instances, Catharsis invokes a discourse reminiscent of insurrectional knowledge practices, which Juan Ricardo Aparicio and Mario Blaser identify as relational, emergent, and contextual ways of knowing that arise from the margins of the lettered city. In addition to disseminating texts that contest dominant representations of Putumayo, Catharsis builds relationships between people and places that prefigure alternative territorial configurations on the ground. According to Magali Rabasa, magazines belong to the category of things people make when they come together face to face, that have meaning not only as products, but also as processes of social and material relations. Workshops, meetings, and encounters along the distribution chain are processes that link people to texts, places, and each other. With each new issue, Catharsis becomes an object in movement that, as one contributor writes, vuelve a calzarse sus botas de caucho, to walk through territory and generate spaces where the process of unraveling paramilitary control might begin to take shape. In this sense, the magazine engages territory as what Michel de Certeau calls a practiced place that can be set in motion and reconfigured through the daily practices of its inhabitants. By mobilizing reading and writing as embodied, affect-driven activities, Catharsis promotes the formation of an alternative relationality that differs from the militarized status quo. The territorial scope of this project becomes clear if we follow Caitlin Murphy in taking affect to mean not only the non-conscious force that arises in the human capacity to act or be acted upon, but also an intensity that flows through the web of connective forces and immaterial circuits that connect bodies, movement, objects, and places. Affective resonances are present in the very title catharsis, which alludes to the experience of emotional release or purification associated with both the consumption of tragic drama and psychoanalytic theories of trauma. One of the magazine's objectives is for readers and writers to experience cathartic healing, which GAB member Ligia Diaz defines as ese proceso gradual de liberación terapéutica a través de la palabra, la memoria y la expresión libre de sentimientos. Diaz links healing and liberation to the writing process and also invites readers to participate in the affective economy of catharsis by immersing themselves in the magazine. Ven, observa la portada, intérnate en ella y empieza a experimentar esa inconfundible sensación catártica cuando ya sientas correr en tu conciencia la savia literaria que se desborda en cada una de sus páginas. The magazine thus asks readers for a kind of participation that is not only intellectual, but also sensorial and embodied. Readers must let the magazine's visuality and literary sap act upon their senses in order to connect with their own rebellious potential. Moving through this process compels readers to join a new collective assemblage that Diaz describes as esa voz que clama justicia, verdad y reparación frente a la violencia social y política de nuestro país. Catharsis is not just an individual emotional experience, but one linked to conscientization and collective action. This affective politics spills into the realm of social relations through the literary discussions, writing workshops, and literacy initiatives organized by the GAB. An earlier essay published by Ligia Diaz in issue 1 describes her experience leading a reading group in La Hormiga when the town was still controlled by the autodefensas. Participants found Germán Castro Caicedo's 2004 crónica Más allá de la noche particularly impactful because of la crudeza de nuestra realidad, por la sin salida en la que estamos inmersos, por la injusticia, la inequidad social y cultural. This and other works provided pretext for discussing issues directly related to daily life in La Hormiga. Diaz also indicates that texts by authors including Maria Mercedes Carranza and Patricia Lara absorbed participants in a way that led not to escapism, but rather to conversations about el poder de la lectura y del libro en nuestras vidas. This kind of reading, which takes place not in a silent solitude, but out loud and in group settings, seeks to cultivate una actitud inteligente y humanizante in the midst of una realidad represiva y pacificadora. Gloria Nupan further explains that circulating catharsis in remote rural areas of the department, which are lacking in libraries or other public repositories of books, transmits gestos de afecto, y ese afecto es un acto político. Like the literary discussion forums, these rural extension efforts approach reading as a social and dialogic activity. Nupan observes that in place of the negative affect that emanates from voces de desánimo, de agresión, de ofensa, de miedo, such encounters promote positive affect in the form of brazos abiertos, oídos atentos, and una voz que dice quiero acompañarte. The magazine's rural readership includes campesinos and demobilized combatants whose earliest experience with written texts may have been, like that of Nupan herself, structured around the propaganda distributed by armed groups. Reading socially in this way represents an attempt to demilitarize minds through affect, which moves beneath the level of consciousness but carries the potential to alter thought and the relationships between people and places that constitute territory. To sum up my argument thus far, I have used the term subterranean to describe how catharsis frames resistance as a process that takes shape beneath the level of visible politics. At the level of both symbolic, content, and material practice, the magazine seeks to disrupt discourses that obscure the human and environmental scope of violence on the Amazonian extractive frontier. Territory figures in this project as a realm of experience that cuts across space and place, as well as the nature-culture, feeling-thinking, and environment-human binaries so central to the rise of Western modernity. The magazine's poetics of resistance are grounded in a nonviolent ethic that is radical because it critiques violent practices in light of what Judith Butler calls the conditions of life and livability that they disrupt. Its force comes from the argument that Putumayense life, humans in connection with the more than human selva, matters at a moment when state-backed paramilitarism, chemical warfare, and extractive enterprises have rendered these lives disposable. Catharsis thus signals the inadequacy of certain peace discourses that either amount to violent pacification, as seen, for example, in the peace through poison arguments used to justify aerial fumigation, or enact more insidious forms of violence by privileging economic development and political liberalism as ultimate societal goals. The magazine's contributors aspire to a different kind of peace that is inseparable from the defense of life in areas deemed peripheral to the nation. This echoes the current trend among social movements in Putumayo and across Colombia to distinguish life from peace in their demands for a less violent society. At this moment, 4 years after the signing of the 2016 peace agreement between the government and the FARC, slogans such as "Que la paz no nos cueste la vida" and "Que la paz no nos mate" have gained currency. The posters on this slide indicate growing frustration with the rising rates of environmental destruction and violence against social leaders in supposedly post-conflict times. The politicization of life in Catharsis resonates beyond Putumayo, implying links between southwestern Colombia and other southern geographies. One contributor's observation that the magazine participates in la búsqueda de alternativas dentro del universo de posibilidades que se quiere construir para los pueblos del sur appears to recognize that extractivism and paramilitary violence repeat across the global south. However, aside from occasional allusions to El Sur, Catharsis remains intensely focused on Putumayo. Its response to a global problem is anchored in the project of altering social life locally. I would like to end by reflecting on the politics of writing from places like Putumayo that have been triply excluded from the lettered city because of social and geographic inequalities, but also because of the censorship imposed by armed groups. Catharsis responded to a context in which print culture actually provided a means of subverting restrictions on public expression. But this was not the case everywhere during the paramilitary occupation of Putumayo. We need only look at the nearby town of El Placer, where the local priest Nelson Cruz refused requests by human rights organizations to write about paramilitary violence because doing so would have endangered his life. Cruz opted instead to speak through objects, which are still cared for by town residents in an old school building now known as the Museo de la Memoria. Like Catharsis, the Museo de la Memoria is one of many spaces throughout Colombia where knowledge about the conflict, and by extension, violence in the neoliberal era, has been produced at the grassroots level. Although, as Freya Shiwi notes, projects such as these are easily dismissed as mere places of catharsis, where people critique violence but affect little change, there is arguably valuable in spaces that allow excluded voices to become the bearer of their own discourse and hear themselves on their own terms. Scott's conceptualization of infrapolitics and recent research on activist media by scholars including Shiwi and Liv Stone further suggests that publications like Catharsis may contribute to the cultural and structural underpinnings of more visible political action. The trajectory of Andrés Cansimance would seem to support this theory. Cansimance's early writings in Catharsis were an important chapter in his formation as an anthropologist and political thinker, who later worked as a core researcher in the Grupo de Memoria Histórica, and now serves as state deputy for the left-wing Progressive Party Colombia Humana. Like other Catharsis contributors who have similarly combined scholarship and activism, Cansimance still maintains active involvement with the magazine and has used it to make writings on political and social thought accessible to readers in Putumayo. To borrow from Gramsci's vocabulary, Catharsis is a space where organic intellectuals move between action and knowledge, the institutions of the lettered city, and the fabric of everyday life in Putumayo. Accounting for the contributions of such figures to alternative imaginaries of nonviolent politics requires that we consider unconventional spaces such as the public library in La Hormiga or the abandoned school building in El Placer as potential sites of intellectual practice. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in the Q&A.